Good morning. Welcome to the online sermon for the 9th Sunday of Pentecost 2021 at Beck's Lutheran Church. Our reading this morning comes to us from the Gospel of John, the 6th chapter, beginning with the first verse. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near, and when he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages wouldn't buy enough bread for each of them to get a bite." One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. And then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." When they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The Gospel of the Lord. One of the Facebook pages that I like to follow is one about Mars and what's currently going on Mars. We've got the newest rover there wandering around the surface of Mars, and now we have a remote helicopter up there, and it kind of just makes you want to think about the sky and sky things. Twice that I remember, I've looked up at the sky and have seen the Milky Way, reaching across the sky, majestic and huge, the visible part from our perspective of the galaxy that Earth is a part of. And it made me want to just stop. And I had to catch my breath. It was astounding. In most places, the sky is too bright to let it be visible. But I saw it once from the top of Little Round Top in Gettysburg, and the second time from a little place in Snow Camp. I have an interest in space and stars and planets, though I'm totally amateur and no expert at anything. But I will say the first time I used my telescope, I looked up at a bright dot in the sky. I didn't really know what it was. I just knew it was a bright dot. I think I figured it was a planet, not a star. But I looked up at it, got it centered in my telescope, got it focused, and found that it was Jupiter. I could even see all 4 of the Galilean moons. And I was stunned. It's a far worse image than anything I'd ever seen in magazines or on TV because it wasn't color corrected, it wasn't blown up, it wasn't, made into this beautiful artistic shot. But it was real. It was right there before my eyes. I gotta say, I think I had an experience of some awe and wonder. I've looked at Mars through my telescope too, but it's not as detailed a view as Jupiter is. Mars may be a lot closer to Earth than Jupiter most of the time, but it is actually a lot smaller. So Jupiter, as the biggest planet in the solar system, is something that's often more dramatic through a telescope. Yeah, on Mars, you can kind of see that there are ice caps in season, but that's about it. I'll rely on the real missions to get good images of Mars. And those pictures of a rocky desert, the occasional dust devil, maybe even a wispy cloud or two, they inspire the same feelings as my telescope view of Jupiter: awe and wonder. Many people have experienced awe and wonder in looking up at the night sky, so much so that those two words, awe and wonder, have sometimes come to be kind of a cliche, a stereotype of what people talk about when they talk about looking at the sky and nature in general. A lot of people find a sense of the infinite up there. An awareness that space it keeps going and going and going. And simultaneously, a lot of people also find that they experience a sense of insignificance. All that space, all those stars, and I'm nothing but a speck of dust. The infinity around us can limit us, can make us feel small, almost worthless sometimes. Some feel lost as well as inspired, lost in the big picture. Now, instead of stars, our reading today from the Gospel of John speaks of bread and fish. Last week we had a reading from Mark, and we had the introduction to this kind of story and the conclusion to that story, but they cut out Mark's version of the 5,000. It is different than John's feeding of the 5,000 story, but for whatever reason, the lectionary folks wanted to put John's version of that story in here this week. So we look at this story, and we find that a little bit like gazing into the heavens, there can also be kind of a sense of infinity in this story. A sense of awe and wonder. Jesus, near Passover time, goes to a mountain, like Moses does. I think the reason they talk about it being Passover is simply to explain why there would be this many people around, because normally the countryside just really doesn't have this many people gathered around. So he goes up on the mountain, and the crowd finds him, and immediately Jesus thinks that they need to eat. So Jesus turns and asks Philip, "What should we do? Where are we going to get enough bread for all of them?" Now the text tells us that Jesus knows what he's going to do, but he wants to see how Philip sees the situation. We wouldn't have found that if we had been reading Mark's version of this. Philip shrugs and says, "I don't know. We can't afford to buy bread for everybody." Andrew tries to help, but in kind of an unhelpful way. "Well, we've got this kid here with these 5 loaves and a couple fish, but that's not going to feed 5,000 people. All Philip and Andrew can see is insignificance. They're operating out of what we might call a mindset of scarcity. Our money is too little. Our food is too small. There's nothing we can do. We're too small. We're helpless. They see only the small picture, how limited and small they are, like someone looking up at the night sky might feel. So, Jesus tells them to get everybody to sit down. And they do. He starts with the bread and says the typical Jewish blessing before breaking bread. This isn't a communion thing. This is something that Jews did and still do. Whenever they have bread, there's a special prayer that goes with the breaking of the bread. Then they distribute both the fish and the bread to everybody who's there. And somehow, impossibly, they all have enough to eat, with a huge amount of leftovers. Everyone is stunned and amazed, so much so that they think Jesus is a prophet, and they even want to just force him to take on the role of king. If this guy can feed them, then they want him to rule them too, so that he can keep feeding them, I'm sure. Now, historically, in interpreting this story, lots of people have different ways of thinking about the events of this story. Some say that this is an example of a miracle over nature. Some say that it's simply that Jesus inspires everyone, like the little boy, to share what food they have, which is a miracle, but a different kind of miracle. But maybe ultimately it's more about how we see the world and our own place in it. What about ourselves? Most of us look at the world with a sense of some insignificance. We're not enough, we tell ourselves. We don't have enough. Or we're too small to really matter. No matter what we do, we're not going to make a difference in the world at large. Scarcity. Scarcity. We're too small. We don't have enough. We're not enough. There's nothing we can do. It's a little like someone gazing up at the sky and how big the universe is and feeling so small compared to the infinity out there. Maybe it's a little bit how Philip and Andrew feel in the story today. Helpless, asked to do this impossible task that they can't even imagine how it's possible to do. Scarcity. It's often how we see the world, ourselves, our churches, other groups that we belong to. But it's not how Jesus sees the world. And it's not how Jesus wants us to see the world. Jesus still calls on us to gaze upon infinity. But it's a different infinity. It's an infinity that dwells within, not just without. The feeding of the 5,000 isn't important because a bunch of people ate. Where are they now? They're all gone. Where are those baskets of all the leftovers? All gone. All of it's gone. None of it's even important, really, because as the Gospel of John likes to do, it refers to this as a sign. This isn't important in its own right. It's important only in what it points to. It's showing you where to look. It's important because of where it points, because it reveals the infinity that resides in Jesus and that can reside in us as well, wants to reside in us as well. This is an infinity that fills us instead of making us feel empty. It makes us feel loved instead of unimportant. It makes us feel warm instead of cold, full instead of empty. Gazing out on the universe can make us feel small and unimportant. It can. But then Jesus comes and teaches you that he and the Father are one, that the Father abides in Jesus, and that the Father and Jesus can abide in us as well. Yeah, there's an infinity out there in the universe. If you were able to just take off and travel in a straight line, far beyond what our most recent billionaire space flights can do, just keep going forever in a straight line, you will never end the universe. You'll never find the end of it. You'll never find an edge. There's an infinity out there in the universe, but there's an infinity in you as well. Instead of closing you off to possibilities, it opens them up. It feeds a crowd of 5,000 people, and it teaches us that we matter. That however we might feel at times, however small or empty or whatever we might feel at times, we're not insignificant after all. The story of the feeding of the 5,000 opens us up to bigger possibilities, a bigger view of the world where we aren't limited by our own small way of thinking and where multitudes can be cared for. It moves us from thinking in the terms that seem to come so naturally to us, thinking in terms of scarcity, always saying, we don't have enough, we're not enough, there's nothing we can do, to instead growing in this, being informed by this, being filled by that infinity that wants to come and abide with us, and begin to think in terms of abundance. Abundance. Yeah, there's a lot of things that we don't have. Yeah, we can't just go out and easily change the world. But we are still full. We are still gifted. We are still provided with abundance. It's a question of finding out what we can do with the abundance. Not the things we can't do, but what can we do? How can we use the abundance that Jesus is giving us today? And so we encounter infinity here. And we find ourselves filled. Yeah, sometimes with bread at meals or at communion. But with something that goes beyond bread too. In this story, we find ourselves filled by infinity. An infinity that we can call Jesus or the Father or God. An infinity that lifts us up and makes us whole, that digs us out of the hole of scarcity that we have dug for ourselves, and opens us up to broad horizons of abundance. And we are all, at last, satisfied with plenty left over to share. Amen.